January 17th, 1945. Over the frozen expanse of the Rhine Valley, 22,000 feet above the earth, the winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields below. The air at altitude was brutally cold, turning breath to ice on oxygen masks, freezing hydraulic fluid in gun turrets. Inside the cockpit of a lone P-47 Thunderbolt, First Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson scanned the horizon with methodical precision. His gloved fingers rested lightly on the control stick, his eyes moving in deliberate arcs, left, right, high, low, the practiced rhythm of a pilot who had learned that survival depended on seeing the enemy before they saw you. But on this particular morning, 7 miles above the German countryside, it was already too late for that. 6 Focke-Wulf 190s were closing in from multiple vectors, their pilots communicating in rapid German over the radio frequencies that Johnson monitored through his headset. They had spotted him. They had coordinated their approach. And they believed they had him trapped. The German voices were confident, almost casual. Position reports, attack vectors, altitude adjustments. The language of a well-drilled squadron executing a textbook intercept. 6 against 1. The mathematics were simple, overwhelming, decisive. What the Germans did not know, what they could not have known, was that the American pilot listening to their every word had no intention of following the script they had written for him. This was not the war the Luftwaffe had trained for in the victory years of 1939 and 1940. By the beginning of 1945, the German Air Force was a shadow of the mighty armada that had terrorized Europe in the early years of the war. The Luftwaffe that had swept across Poland, that had darkened the skies over France, that had bombed London night after night, no longer existed. What remained was a defensive force, outnumbered and outgunned, fighting a losing battle against an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources. American fighters filled the skies in numbers that defied comprehension. Every day, hundreds of bombers crossed into German airspace, escorted by swarms of Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Lightnings. When German pilots managed to shoot one down, 2 more appeared the next day to take its place. It was an arithmetic of attrition that could only end one way. The German pilots who still flew in early 1945 were a mixture of exhausted veterans and undertrained replacements. The veterans had survived years of combat on multiple fronts: the Eastern Front, the Mediterranean, the defense of the Reich itself. They had accumulated kills, earned decorations, watched friends die. They flew by instinct and experience, but they were bone-tired, flying aircraft patched together from salvaged parts, operating on fuel rations that grew smaller each month. The replacements, boys barely out of training, had logged perhaps 20 hours in their fighters before being sent into combat. They were brave, often recklessly so, but they lacked the experience to survive against American pilots who had trained for hundreds of hours before seeing their first combat. On this January morning, the 6-plane German formation represented both types. The flight leader was a veteran, an Oberleutnant with 31 confirmed kills and a Knight's Cross at his throat. The others ranged from moderately experienced to dangerously green. They had been scrambled from their base near Bonn to intercept reported American fighter bombers operating in the area. When they spotted the lone P-47, they saw an opportunity too perfect to pass up. The American appeared to be alone, separated from his squadron, vulnerable. The German leader ordered a coordinated attack. 2 fighters would engage from above, 2 from the sides, and 2 would position themselves to cut off any escape route. It was a classic hammer and anvil maneuver, one they had practiced dozens of times. But as they moved into position, something began to feel wrong. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was a brute of an aircraft, nicknamed the Jug, for its bulky barrel-shaped fuselage. It was not graceful like the Mustang or nimble like the Spitfire. What it was tough. The Thunderbolt could absorb punishment that would have destroyed lighter fighters. Its radial engine, a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800, could keep running even after taking multiple cannon hits. Its 850 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. And in a dive, with its weight and power, it could outrun almost anything the Luftwaffe could field. American pilots had learned to exploit these characteristics, to fight not according to European conventions, but according to American pragmatism. Use your strengths, avoid your weaknesses, and never, ever fight fair. Johnson understood his aircraft intimately. He knew exactly what it could do and what it could not. More importantly, he understood what the Germans expected him to do, and he had no intention of obliging them. The German flight leader's voice crackled over the radio. "Prepare to engage. Attack on my mark." The 6 Focke-Wulfs tightened their formation, moving into their assigned positions. The 2 high fighters began their dive. The side elements closed laterally. The blocking pair climbed to cut off escape. It should have been textbook. It should have been over in 30 seconds. Instead, the Thunderbolt suddenly rolled hard to the right and accelerated, not away from the attack, but directly toward the 2 fighters on the right flank. The maneuver was aggressive, unexpected, illogical. Fighter pilots did not fly toward multiple opponents. They fled, they evaded, they maneuvered defensively. But this American was charging, his 8 machine guns already beginning to sparkle with muzzle flashes. The German radio traffic changed instantly. The calm coordination dissolved into confusion and alarm. "He's turning into us! Break right, break right! Where is he now?" And then, cutting through the chatter, a voice that would later be transcribed by Allied radio intelligence. "He's not flying like a normal pilot." Johnson's aggressive turn had shattered the German formation's timing. The 2 fighters diving from above suddenly had no target where they expected one to be. The side fighters he was charging toward broke formation instinctively, self-preservation overriding discipline. The blocking element found themselves out of position, watching the fight unfold in the wrong sector of sky. In 3 seconds, the carefully planned attack had become chaos, and Johnson was just getting started. He did not try to dogfight with the Focke-Wulfs. Dogfighting, twisting, turning, trying to get on an opponent's tail, played to the strengths of the German fighters, which were lighter and more maneuverable at medium speeds. Instead, Johnson used his speed. He made a single high-speed pass at the broken formation, his guns hammering out a stream of 50 caliber rounds, then dove away before the Germans could react. The Thunderbolt accelerated in the dive, gravity and engine power combining to push it past 450 miles per hour. No Focke-Wulf could match that speed. By the time the Germans reorganized and tried to pursue, Johnson was already pulling up into a climb, using his excess speed to regain altitude. The German flight leader tried to reassert control. "Reform on me! Stay together!" But his squadron was scattered across miles of sky now, each pilot reacting individually, instinctively, no longer functioning as a coordinated unit. Johnson had achieved what every outnumbered pilot dreams of. He had turned 6 opponents into 6 separate problems, each of which could be dealt with individually. Over the next 10 minutes, the engagement devolved into a running battle across the Rhine Valley. Johnson would climb, spot an isolated German fighter, dive on it in a slashing attack, fire a burst, then extend away before the others could converge on him. He never stayed to dogfight. He never let himself get slow. He refused to play their game. Each attack was perfectly calculated. Use altitude, use speed, use surprise, then disengage before the odds could turn against him. The Germans, trained to fight in formations where mutual support was everything, found themselves facing an opponent who refused to let them use their training. The radio intercepts captured the growing panic in the German communications. "I cannot keep up with him. He is too fast. Where did he go?" The flight leader's commands became sharper, more desperate. He could feel control slipping away, could see his carefully trained formation disintegrating into a confused mob of individual fighters, each trying to survive against an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Johnson's tactics were not improvised. They were the product of doctrine developed over 3 years of hard fighting by the United States Army Air Forces. American training emphasized individual initiative, aggressive action, and exploitation of technical advantages. Pilots were taught to think for themselves, to analyze the tactical situation, to make independent decisions. This approach was fundamentally different from the German system, which emphasized formation integrity and adherence to established tactics. The German system had worked brilliantly when the Luftwaffe had superior numbers and could dictate the terms of engagement. But in 1945, outnumbered and outmatched, the rigid adherence to doctrine had become a liability. The object that symbolized this difference was not a weapon or piece of equipment, but something more abstract: the throttle. Johnson's hand lived on the throttle throughout the engagement, constantly adjusting power, managing speed, using the Thunderbolt's massive engine to create and maintain the energy advantage that kept him alive. The Germans, flying fighters that were more maneuverable but slower and less powerful, could not match his energy management. Every time they thought they had him cornered, he simply poured on power and accelerated away. The throttle represented the fundamental difference between the American and German war efforts: abundance versus scarcity, overwhelming industrial power versus dwindling resources. After 10 minutes of fruitless pursuit, with ammunition running low and fuel gauges dropping toward critical levels, the German flight leader made the only decision he could: break off, return to base. The order was an admission of defeat, a recognition that they could not bring down this lone American, that continuing the engagement would only waste precious fuel and perhaps cost them aircraft they could not replace. The 6 Focke-Wulfs turned east, climbing for altitude, leaving the Rhine Valley behind. Johnson watched them go, his own fuel gauge showing less than a quarter tank. He had not shot down any of them. His attacks had been intended to disrupt and scatter, not to score kills, but he had achieved something more important. He had survived. And he had shown 6 German pilots that the war they were fighting was not the war they had been trained for. What the Germans expected that morning was a quick, clean victory. 1 American fighter against 6 of their own. The odds were overwhelming. Their tactics were sound. Their aircraft were capable. They believed, even in January 1945, that German training and experience would carry the day in any fair fight. What they experienced instead was a fighter pilot who refused to fight fair, who exploited every technical and tactical advantage, who turned their coordinated attack into isolated chaos. The engagement lasted less than 15 minutes, but it crystallized everything that had gone wrong for the Luftwaffe in the final year of the war. They were still brave, they were still skilled, but they were fighting an enemy that had learned to use freedom of action, technological superiority, and raw industrial power to make bravery and skill insufficient. Johnson landed at his base in France an hour later with barely enough fuel to taxi to his revetment. His after-action report was brief and factual: engaged by 6 enemy fighters, executed hit-and-run attacks, disengaged when enemy broke contact, returned to base. No claims submitted. The intelligence officers noted it with interest, another data point showing that German fighter tactics were becoming increasingly defensive and tentative. But they could not have known about the panicked radio transmissions, about the voice cutting through the chaos saying, "He's not flying like a normal pilot." Because that was the point. Johnson was not flying like a normal pilot, not by German standards anyway. He was flying like an American, trained in a system that valued initiative over obedience, aggression over caution, results over doctrine. The Luftwaffe had produced magnificent pilots, tacticians who could execute complex maneuvers with precision, warriors who fought with incredible bravery. But by 1945, precision and bravery were not enough against an enemy that brought overwhelming resources and a fundamentally different philosophy of air combat to every engagement. The throttle, pushed forward to maximum power over and over throughout that January morning, represented more than just engine output. It represented the capacity of American industry to build engines that could sustain maximum power for extended periods without failing. It represented the fuel supplies that allowed American pilots to train for hundreds of hours before seeing combat. It represented the maintenance crews who could keep aircraft flying mission after mission. It represented the replacement pilots and aircraft that arrived in an endless stream. When Johnson pushed that throttle forward and accelerated away from the German fighters, he was not just using mechanical power. He was deploying the full weight of American industrial democracy against an enemy that had exhausted its capacity to compete. The 6 German pilots who returned to their base near Bonn that afternoon filed their own reports. They described engaging a single American fighter that used unusual tactics, refusing to dogfight, and instead making repeated high-speed passes. They noted that the enemy pilot appeared to have excellent situational awareness and energy management. They did not mention the panic in their radio communications, the moment when their carefully coordinated attack fell apart, the feeling of helplessness, as their opponent dictated the entire engagement. Those things did not go into official reports, but they were discussed quietly in the crew quarters that evening, and they contributed to a growing sense among German pilots that the war in the air was lost, that no amount of skill or courage could overcome the sheer material superiority of their opponents. The war continued for another 4 months. Germany surrendered in May 1945. By that time, the Luftwaffe had been destroyed, not in any single decisive battle, but through attrition, through 1,000 engagements like the one over the Rhine Valley on that cold January morning. The German pilots who survived told stories for years afterward about the American fighters, about the endless numbers, about the aggressive tactics, about pilots who seemed to have been trained to think independently rather than follow doctrine. They told these stories with a mixture of respect and incomprehension, unable to fully understand how an air force that seemed so undisciplined, so willing to break the established rules of air combat, had proven so devastatingly effective. The truth was that American air doctrine had been built on a foundation of freedom. Freedom to think, freedom to act, freedom to exploit opportunities. It was messy and sometimes wasteful, and it required an industrial base that could absorb losses and continue producing. But it worked. And in the skies over Germany in 1945, it worked with brutal efficiency against an enemy that had built its air force on precision, discipline, and adherence to proven tactics. The German system was not inferior. It was simply brittle. When things went according to plan, it was magnificent. But when things went wrong, when a lone American pilot refused to fly like a normal pilot, the entire structure could shatter in moments. The throttle, symbol of American power, had been pushed forward one more time, and the enemy had been unable to match it. That simple act, repeated in thousands of cockpits across the European theater, carried more weight than any single weapon or tactic. It represented the choice that free societies make when threatened: to mobilize everything, to hold nothing back, to push the throttle to maximum and keep it there until victory is achieved. The cost was enormous. The waste was staggering, but the result was inevitable. In the end, the panicked voice on the German radio had been exactly right. Johnson was not flying like a normal pilot. He was flying like a pilot trained in a system that believed individual initiative mattered more than rigid doctrine, that believed aggressive action trumped defensive precision, that believed the way to win was not to fight fair, but to fight smart. That voice, speaking those words in alarm over the Rhine Valley, had unknowingly articulated the epitaph of the Luftwaffe. They had been defeated by an enemy who refused to play by the rules they had written, who brought new rules that emphasized freedom, flexibility, and overwhelming force. The old rules could not survive contact with the new reality. And so they broke, scattered across the sky like the German formation that morning, dissolving into confusion and retreat, leaving nothing behind but intercepted radio transmissions and the memory of a moment when everything fell apart at once.